London, a May morning in 1455. The first rays of spring sunlight danced on the surface of the River Thames. The city was still at peace, but the ancient stone walls of the Tower of London had already heard whispers of danger. A secret council among the lords was underway. The throne of England, once seemingly solid as rock after the glorious reign of Henry V, now trembled like a boat in a storm. Henry VI, the weak and unstable son of a great hero, had become the centerpiece of a bloody game of power. He was no warrior, no statesman. He was a puppet pulled by the strings of the ambitious within the court, from powerful lords to his determined wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. And yet, the problem was not just him. It ran deeper, embedded in royal blood, where two branches of the same family tree began to clash, the House of Lancaster, bearing the blood-red rose, and the House of York, with its cold white blossom. Both had a rightful claim to the crown, and in an age where the sword spoke louder than the law, that could mean only one thing: war. In 1422, when the mighty King Henry V suddenly died at the age of 35, England abruptly fell into the hands of a child who had not yet spoken a single word, Henry VI, only 9 months old. A victorious kingdom, enriched by war in France, now had to entrust its fate to a regency council, made up of ambitious, powerful nobles, but lacking unity. These men were no dreamers. They were wolves in cloaks, each craving ultimate power. Among them was Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the king's paternal uncle, and no less formidable was Cardinal Beaufort, a cunning and immensely wealthy relative from the House of Lancaster. Thus began the struggle for influence around the throne, in silence and deceit, with no bloodshed yet, but fraught with hidden peril. Henry VI grew up amidst these schemes, but he did not grow into a monarch. He became pious, devout, and dreamy, a priest in royal robes. And in a court full of serpents, kindness was a fatal weakness. Meanwhile, in the north of England, another figure was rising, Richard, the third Duke of York. He was a direct descendant of the second line of Edward III, and in theory his bloodline was even purer than that of the Lancasters. At first, he remained silent and dutiful, but deep inside he understood. Henry VI's incompetence was an opportunity too great to ignore. Things worsened in the 1440s when Henry VI, in a strange and short-sighted decision, married Margaret of Anjou. She was beautiful, intelligent, and determined, and French. The marriage came without a dowry and with the concession of the region of Maine to France. The public was outraged. The nobility grew suspicious. Factions formed clearly, the Queen and her French courtiers versus those loyal to the House of York. By 1450, England was in crisis. Jack Cade, a common man from Kent, led a rebellion against the corrupt court. The uprising was crushed, but it held up a mirror to the nation's condition, a country that no longer believed in its king. Then came tragedy. In 1453, just as Margaret was pregnant with her first son, Henry VI suddenly fell into a catatonic state, almost completely insane. He did not speak, he did not react, he did not recognize his wife or his child. The court was stunned. During this time, Richard of York stepped out of the shadows. Backed by powerful families such as the Nevilles, Mowbrays, and Bourchier, he was appointed protector of the realm. For one brief year, Richard governed England with order and effectiveness, but when Henry recovered at the end of 1454, he immediately dismissed Richard and returned power to the Queen. The cup had overflowed. Richard had no choice left. He raised his banners, the Yorks and Lancasters officially entered into war, and at St. Albans in May 1455, the first blood was spilled onto English soil. May 27, 1455. The rain had just stopped. The narrow streets of St. Albans were as peaceful as ever. But then, from the south, the sound of battle horns pierced the air. Drums thundered. The army of Richard, Duke of York, had arrived. On the damp ground, around 3,000 soldiers of the House of York raised their long bows, spears, and banners bearing the white lion, the symbol of York. Opposite them stood the king's forces, led by the Duke of Somerset, a close ally of Queen Margaret, entrenched behind narrow lanes, brick houses, and makeshift barricades. The Lancastrian force numbered around 2,000 men. The first clash of the Wars of the Roses did not begin as a blood-soaked assault, but as a cautious probe. Richard initially requested an audience with the king, not to assassinate him, but to purge the court of flatterers, especially Somerset. But the king refused, Somerset refused, and the soldiers had no choice but to act. Around mid-morning, the Yorkists launched a frontal attack on the town centre. Skilled archers from Yorkshire rained arrows on the wooden barricades, but the Lancastrians held firm. The streets were too narrow, making it difficult to deploy large forces. As the battle reached a stalemate, Warwick, the Earl of Warwick and Richard's trusted ally, made a bold move. He led a detachment around the gardens and ancient stone walls. From the west, they suddenly stormed into the heart of the town, where the Lancastrians were unprepared. Within minutes, the Lancastrian defences were shattered. Yorkist troops surged in like a flood. The streets of St. Albans became a blood-soaked battlefield. The Duke of Somerset was killed in action, grievously wounded by multiple blows as he fought beside the king. King Henry VI, who bore no sword, wore no armour, and was sitting quietly in an inn near the town centre, was lightly wounded by a stray arrow. Richard quickly took custody of the king, but did not harm him. He continued to proclaim loyalty, insisting that his goal was to remove power-hungry courtiers, not to seize the throne. However, no matter how he denied it, the truth was undeniable. A civil war had officially begun. The blood of the nobility, those closest to the royal family, had been spilled. Somerset was dead. Dozens of knights lay slain, and Henry VI, now a hostage in the hands of his own kinsman, was but a shadow of a king. St. Albans was a small battle in scale, but its consequences were monumental. It opened the door to decades of division, hatred, and violence. It raised a question not heard since the 12th century. Who has the right to rule England? The one who wears the crown, or the one who holds real power? Margaret of Anjou did not sit idle. Upon hearing of Somerset's death and the defeat, she immediately withdrew to the north, where she began rebuilding her forces. Meanwhile, Richard of York, though in control of the king, still lacked the boldness to claim the crown. He accepted the title of Protector of the realm once more, but now the Lancastrians would no longer yield so easily. The conflict was no longer a courtly dispute. It had become a life-and-death struggle between two houses, York and Lancaster. Two roses, one white, one red, would drench each other in blood for nearly 3 more decades. In the shadows of the chaotic years following the Battle of St. Albans, one name gradually rose above even Richard of York: Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. History would remember him as the Kingmaker, a title without precedent in English history. Warwick was more than just a wealthy noble. He possessed numerous castles and estates stretching from the north to the Midlands, but more importantly, he was a political genius, a man who knew when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to betray. After Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, a devastating defeat in which his head was severed and placed on the city walls with a mocking paper crown. It was Warwick who stepped forward to continue the war. Richard's successor was his son, Edward, a tall, strong young man in his early 20s, full of vigour and charisma. Warwick saw in Edward a pawn, a future king he could control. In 1461, with Warwick's backing, Edward declared himself King Edward IV of England, following a glorious victory at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles in English history. Towton was a nightmare in the snow. In the freezing wind, over 50,000 soldiers from both sides clashed on the white fields. Arrows darkened the sky, the ground was slick with blood and melting snow. When the battle ended, around 28,000 lay dead, so many that the bodies had to be buried in mass graves, and villagers spent weeks clearing the battlefield. After this victory, Edward IV was crowned king. Warwick became the second most powerful man in the kingdom, but their alliance would not last long. Warwick wanted to control the court, to arrange a political marriage for Edward, especially one with a French princess, to secure an alliance. But Edward refused. Worse, he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widowed noblewoman of lower rank without political value and from an ambitious family. Warwick was furious. The Woodvilles quickly overwhelmed the court, seizing titles and influence. Warwick felt betrayed. He, who had placed Edward on the throne, was now pushed to the margins. Like a master chess player, Warwick changed sides. He began an alliance with his former enemies, Queen Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrian faction. He even married his daughter to Prince Edward, son of Henry VI. Warwick, the man who had once deposed Henry, now sought to restore him. In 1470, Warwick succeeded. Edward the Fob was overthrown and forced to flee to Flanders. Henry VI, after nearly a decade in captivity, was returned to the throne. But the king was no longer lucid. He lived in delusion, unfit to rule. Real power rested in Warwick's hands. However, the Lancastrian restoration lasted only a year. Edward IV returned with a large army, and this time more determined and ruthless. In 1471, he retook London and defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. Warwick was killed, not in glory, but in the thick fog of a chaotic April morning. That same year, Prince Edward, heir to the Lancastrians, was also slain at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret was captured, and just days later, Henry VI, the final symbol of Lancastrian legitimacy, died in prison, likely murdered on Edward IV's orders. The throne was secured, the House of York had triumphed, but the cost was the near extinction of an entire generation of nobility. Warwick had made kings and unmade them. But in the end, he was just another piece crushed in the most brutal chess game in England's history. After years of bloodshed, it seemed that peace had finally arrived for the House of York. Edward IV, strong, decisive, and beloved, consolidated his power, crushed the seeds of rebellion, and built a stable court. But as with every chapter in the chronicle of the Wars of the Roses, death was never far behind. In 1483, Edward V died suddenly at the age of 40. His untimely death left the throne to his son, Edward V, who was only 12 years old. Amid a court divided by factions and intrigue, another name stepped out of the shadows. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward VI's younger brother. Richard was a complex figure. He had once been fiercely loyal to his brother and had fought tirelessly for the Yorkist cause. But when power lay within his grasp, that loyalty began to waver. In the name of protecting the young king, Richard quickly took control of the royal household. He seized Edward V and his younger brother, Prince Richard, and imprisoned them both in the Tower of London. The two boys, known to history as the Princes in the Tower, were never seen again. Then came a shocking announcement. Parliament declared Edward IV's marriage invalid. The two princes were labelled illegitimate. The throne was now empty. Just weeks later, Richard was crowned king, Richard III. But the spectre of the two princes continued to haunt him. Though no concrete evidence was ever found, many believed Richard had secretly ordered their murder. It was a stain that would never wash away. Richard III was a capable ruler. He reformed the legal system, fought corruption, and sought justice. But all of it was overshadowed by the most haunting event of his reign, the disappearance of the two boys. From the western lands of Wales, a man with Lancastrian blood rose up, Henry Tudor. With a lineage that mixed Lancaster and a hint of Plantagenet, Henry became a new beacon of hope for those who opposed Richard. Backed by France and numerous exiled nobles, Henry launched an invasion of England in 1485. The fateful battle was fought at Bosworth Field. Richard III, though betrayed mid-battle by his own allies, charged directly into enemy lines in a desperate attempt to kill Henry with his own hand. He nearly succeeded, but was surrounded and slain on the battlefield. Legend has it that he cried out, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," a tragic line immortalized by Shakespeare. Richard's body was stripped of armour, slung over a horse, and brought back to Leicester as a trophy. The House of York collapsed. A bloody chapter came to an end. Henry Tudor was crowned king, Henry VII. And to end the divisions, he married Elizabeth, the daughter of Edward IV, niece of Richard III. The bloodlines of Lancaster and York were united. A new dynasty was born, the House of Tudor. But the ghosts of the past, the plots, the assassinations, the missing children, would forever linger in the nation's memory. The Wars of the Roses had ended, but the divisions did not heal easily. After the Battle of Bosworth, Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, ascended the throne, bringing an end to over 30 years of conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. However, in the minds of the English people, the wounds from this civil war never truly healed. Henry VII understood that his dynasty remained fragile even as the victor. To strengthen his claim to the throne, he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, thereby uniting the two formerly warring houses. This marriage was not merely a symbol of reconciliation, it was also a strategic move to reduce the dissatisfaction of those who still supported the Yorkist cause. With the crown on his head, Henry VII began a determined effort to rebuild the nation. He restored order, curtailed the power of the nobility, and worked to stabilize the kingdom's economy. Yet he still faced rebellions from Yorkist supporters who refused to accept the rule of the Lancastrian line. One of the most significant challenges came in 1487 with the imposture of Lambert Simnel. Simnel, an orphaned boy, was propped up by Yorkist loyalists as a legitimate heir to the throne with the support of rebels within the realm. This conflict, known as the Battle of Stoke, ended in a victory for Henry's forces, but it made clear that Yorkist resistance was not yet extinguished. Henry VII not only dealt with internal uprisings, but also faced threats from abroad. Neighbouring powers, particularly France, frequently sought to interfere in England's internal affairs. However, Henry was astute in forging alliances with European powers. His diplomatic relations with France, Spain, and other nations helped reinforce his rule and shield his throne from potential enemies. Although the Wars of the Roses had formally ended, their legacy lingered. Through caution and skill, Henry VII laid the foundation for the Tudor dynasty, allowing it to endure for generations. Yet for those who had lived in the shadow of war, reconciliation remained a distant dream. Power struggles and political scheming never truly disappeared from the English realm. Henry VII died in 1509, leaving the crown to his son, Henry VIII. While Henry VIII would dramatically reshape English history with religious reforms and his infamous marriages, it was the beginning of the Tudor dynasty that had brought an end to the Wars of the Roses and centuries of turmoil. Still, to those who had fought and suffered, names like Richard III, Edward IV, and Margaret of Anjou remained indelible in the annals of history. Throughout the war, England had undergone profound social, political, and economic changes. The dynastic rivalries and bloody conflicts helped shape the nation's future and the legacy of subsequent monarchs. The lessons of the Wars of the Roses about power, betrayal, and the significance of international diplomacy still echo through English and world history. The history of this war is not just a tale of battles, uprisings, and kings who triumphed or fell. It is also the story of people, nobles, soldiers, and ordinary folk who lived through that bloody era, clinging to the hope of a brighter future, even if that hope was no more than a dream in the dark nights of war. And so, the Wars of the Roses came to an end. The lessons of the conflict, the stories of betrayal and sacrifice left a lasting imprint on the English soul. But, as in all historical narratives, people continued walking their own paths, making choices and decisions that would shape generations to come. With the unification of the great houses of Lancaster and York, the Tudor dynasty opened a new chapter in English history. And the Wars of the Roses, with all their pain and loss, left behind a legacy that can never be forgotten. If you enjoy dramatic historical tales like the Wars of the Roses, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you.